G'day everyone, Dicko here with another kick-ass walkthrough. This is part 4 of a multi-part series that covers character rigging. In this video, I'm going to show you the process of creating a very basic FK-driven rig. So, what does that mean? Well, it's a basic rig that has some hip controls, as you can see here, and a basic joint chain or control chain that controls the upper torso. Very simple stuff, and every basic rig has this. So as we go forward into creating more complex spine rigs, you'll also need to know the very fundamentals, which would be to make something as simple as this rig here. So if you were to make a very simple character rig, this is all you kind of need. But if you choose to go with something more advanced and you want stretch controls and you want twist controls, all that sort of fancy shit, then the next video, which will be part 4B, will cover bendy bone spine rigs. And then if you want even more control, we will get into the ultimate spine rig, which will be part 4C, and that will involve a spline IK rig. So for those who are just looking to make a very simple control rig, and you can easily animate with this, by the way, you can easily do whatever you need to do with your character with this setup, just with a little less finesse. You can still create some amazing animation with this rig setup. So what I've created here is essentially a global control that will control the entire character. We've got our center of gravity control, which will cover the the center of gravity. As you can see, the arms and the legs are moving at the moment because we don't have those rigged up yet. And then we have the hips down that sort of hierarchy that control, the bottom half of the body essentially. And then we have the upper body, which will control the spine essentially. So let's jump into it from scratch. All right, cool. So we got our setup here, very simple sort of joint setup. It's all manipulating quite well. Very cool. All right. So what can we do to make this thing a lot more easier to control? All we got to do is basically create 3 joints, well actually 4 joints to set up this entire thing. So first thing I need to do is create a global control joint that will act as our global manipulator for our upper body, like a center of gravity. We need to create a hip control, and then we have to create a FK joint chain that will work as our manipulator for the spine. So first thing I want to do is select everything, and I want to, except for the bottom control there, and I want to move it to the last layer. So push M on your keyboard to bring that up. Let me just bring up my screencast keys. You want to push M on your keyboard and move it to the end there. So I want to make sure that all my deformed joints are on a separate armature layer in the armature settings. That will allow me to understand that anything that's not in that little layer there, anything that's not in this layer here at the end, is a mechanical joint or a control joint, okay? So eventually we'll have a pretty nicely organized layer system for our armature setup here. Okay, the next thing I want to do is create a joint or a bone that will act as our global control and as our hip control. So we have 2 bones in the same location. So if I grab this joint here, this is kind of where I want my hip to pivot from the hips. I want to create 2 joints or 2 bones from this point onwards. So I'm going to select this part of our bone chain and push Shift S, cursor to selected. And I'm going to create, firstly, 1 new bone. I'm going to scale that down using individual origins and local transforms. All right. And I'm going to call it, in the bone settings, I'm going to call it Control COG. So center of gravity. And I'm going to turn off the functionality for deform. So I don't want this to be deforming at all if I ever have to do a new weight paint, okay, or automatic weights. So I want to turn that off from the get-go. Always make sure that when you're working with mechanical bones or control bones that you always, straight away, as soon as you make them, you turn off deform, because you're going to end up with a lot of issues if you don't. Okay, the second thing I need to do is make another one. So I'm going to duplicate that one, and I'm going to probably scale that down a little bit. And I'm going to call that control hips .001. Okay. I'll make sure this one's called control COG.001 because I like to keep things numbered. And in the armature view, make sure that you got in the viewport settings, I want to turn off shading. I want to make it display as wire so it's easier to click on things. Okay. So straight off the bat, I want to make this hip control a child of my COG. Control P, keep offset, and then I want to make this COG control a child of that global control at the bottom there. Okay, so let's move these guys to the first layer at the start. So M to move, and we've moved them to the appropriate layer. And I want to get this COG control to be a child of this global control. So Control P, keep offset. Okay, cool. To bring back the view of our deform rig, we can just push Shift and click in the armature viewport settings there. Okay, so to recap and reiterate what I'm doing here, let's just demonstrate. So right now, the deform rig hasn't been attached at all to our controls. All I'm doing is setting up the hierarchy for what will become the control rig. So right now we have a global bone that's controlling both the COG and the hips, and then we have the COG that can control the hips but not the entire rig, and then we have the hip control doing its own thing on its own. Okay, so that's how the hierarchy is at the moment. So eventually we will link everything up, but first we need to create, I would say, 3 more bones that will represent our FK joint chain going up the spine. Okay, so let's go back into edit mode, and I'm going to duplicate the hip bone, or the hip control, sorry, the hip control, and keep it in the exact same spot. I'm going to scale that down because this bone, or this, what will become the control underscore FK spine, what's called torso .001, will control the joint chain going up the spine, whereas the hips will control the joint chain going down the spine. Okay, as in underneath, below that pivot point. Okay, so we got that bone. We're going to keep it in the exact same spot. Don't worry about it right now. We're going to now duplicate this guy. Duplicate torso.001. And if we look at the joint chain, I want it to sit on the next stage of our spine. So this is where our hips are pivoting from. The next stage in our spine is here. So I want it to sit on that spinal part there. So I'm going to go Shift S, selection to cursor. I'm going to scale that up so it's a bit easier to see. So now torso.002 will control the spine going from here upwards. Okay. All right. One more duplication of that. So I'm going to duplicate that bone one more time. And in this case, we can either call it torso 003 or I can call it chest 001. It's up to you. I think I'll just call it torso 003 to make life easier for me. So let's look at that joint setup there. Again, we want it to pivot from this area, from the upper side of this chest area. So I'm going to move my 3D cursor to here. So Shift S, selection to cursor to selected. Bring back my my FK torso.003 and go cursor to selected. Oops, sorry. Selection to cursor. My bad. Selection to cursor. All right. So this is what we have at the moment. I'm going to hide the deform rig just to reiterate what we're doing. So what we got is, at the moment, we have the control COG, which is the parent of the hips. Okay, the hips are these guys. All right. Now, the hips will be separate from the spine rig, okay? So what we're going to do with control FK torso.001 is we're going to make it a child of the COG. And I'll explain why that's happening now. So it's already a child of that. That's good. So what we can do now is make the control FK torso.002 a child of torso 001. And this is why it's important to, again, make layers. So what we're going to do, I'm going to temporarily hide the COG control and the hips control. I'm going to select all my FK controls, bones, and move them to another layer so it's easier to select. And what I'm going to do is basically create the joint chain for that. I'm going to link all these up. Okay, so what we're going to do, I know that this is at the right pivot points along the chain at the base, so I need to move the tail of these controls down so they kind of fit together. And it'll all come together soon, don't you worry. So I'm going to go here and press cursor to selected and move the cursor there. Grab the tail of the FK001 and make it selection to cursor. So I'm just going to link them all up so that there's a nice clean setup there. Selection to cursor at the base, sorry. Cursor to selected at the base of our chest there. And selection to cursor there. So now we have a clean control setup there for our spine. And I'm going to go and make set up the hierarchy of this now. So the chest control will be a child of the torso 002. Torso 002 will be a child of the FK001. Keep offset. I'm keeping offset for now because I don't really want them to be connected. That's okay. You can have it connected if you want. It's not a big deal. Alright. And then I'm going to go back to my layers and unhide that setup there. So what we have now is a... Right now we have a control setup like so. Global control is moving everything. Okay? COG is moving, at the moment, just the hips. It's moving everything, including the spine, sorry. The hips and the spine. Okay? The hips are moving independently from the spine. Okay? The spine controls are now working like an FK chain, like so. And if I were to move the COG, it would all move together. Okay? Cool. That's the basic setup. We're done with the basic setup for our control setup here. So now it's about setting up our constraints and the parenting for our hip setup, hip and spine setup. Okay, so what we need to do is make these two controls, or two deformed joints, to be manipulated by the hips, essentially. Because what's going to happen is the hips will control downwards from that pivot point. So, pretty simple thing to do. We're just going to grab the these two joints here and make them a child of these hips, of this hip control. And then from here on in, from the top up, we're going to make these joints a child, or even constrain them to the spine controls. So what we need to do is go to our deform setup here, available to us to select. We're going to select these two joints, select our hips, and push Control P, make parent, keep offset. Alright, let's go into pose mode and test that out. So now, the control hips.001 should control the bottom of the hips. And you can see here that because we haven't set up the actual pelvis joints to be a child of our spine, it's not manipulating. But if we do that now, so let's grab these two pelvis joints, make them a child of the hips down there. You can see it's now manipulating as you'd expect with that hippie action. Okay? Alright, cool. So that's the hips done. The hips are done. It's that simple. even though it doesn't sound that simple when I talk about it. So the hips are done. Now it's up to us to work through the spine. So now we can actually hide the COG and the hips in that layer. So we're just going to bring back our spine set up there, and bring back our deform joints there. So it's a bit hard to see that they're actually overlapping. You can see in the labels there, they're actually overlapping, which is a real pain. But all we need to know is that once we click on the Control FK, and then we can click on Control on the Def Spine 002, we've got the right order of our selection. So what we want to do, we want to constrain the deform spine to the Control FK. Alright, so again, select Control FK, then select deform spine 002. Control Shift C, copy transforms. Boom. Okay, let's do the same thing again. Up the chain. I'm going to select the Control FK torso.002. Then Shift select the deform spine. Copy transforms. Boom. And finally, again, one more. Control FK torso 003. Select the spine. Copy transforms. Done. Alright. Now let's see what happens when we hide the deform rig. Let's hide the deform setup here and just bring back all our controls so far. Alright. We have our global control. Manipulates everything. Our COG, while it will appear that we're controlling everything, is only controlling the torso. Okay, it's doing its thing. That's it's supposed to happen. Alright. Let's select the hips. It's manipulating the hips. Nice. Now, let's have a look at the torso, FK torso. So the FK torso is only manipulating the upper body down the chain. Just like that. Sweet. Perfect. Another thing to be aware of is make sure that your joint orientations are always matching your deform rig. So in this case, we're pretty good. Everything's facing the right direction. Z is forward on up the chain. So that's good to know. But that's the basic setup all done. So all we need to do now is add some actual control shapes to make this less confusing and more manageable. So let's do that now. Okay, starting with the global control, let's make a very simple control for that. All right, let's go into object mode, and we're going to make a new shape, any old mesh. We're going to choose a circle. Let's just bring that back down to ground there. And what I would like to do with most of my controls, I want to add a line down the center with a little arrow to show which direction the main point of axis is. So in this case, I want it to say that, you know, forward facing, this is the control. So I'm going to go into edit mode. And I'm going to fill in a edge down there. I'm going to extrude out a line. And then I'm going to do the same thing on this side. Extrude out on the X. Extrude out on the X in the opposite direction there. And I'm basically making a sort of arrow. I'm not being very accurate here, but I can if I want to. I can actually hold down control and sort of snap it to the grid. So let's actually do that. Let's add grid snapping. Absolute grid snap. And just snap everything there. Make it nice and clean. There we go. Add the arrow shape. There we go. Done. So that's our control setup for that. I'm going to name that. Rename that. Widget. Global control. Alright. And I'm going to move that into its own collection. New collection. Widgets. Okay. Let's go to pose mode, and we're going to make this control the bone shape for this control. So let's go to viewport display, custom shape, and we're going to just pick that, and we're good to go. Awesome. And you can always scale that down to fit, you know, sort of, you know, it's going to be about the right size that way. All right, cool. So that controls up. We can actually now select that as a, you know, controller in pose mode. So you can see you can actually control the setup like that, which is cool. Let's do the same thing for the rest of our joints here. So I'm going to make a new shape for our COG. So I'm going to make a plane in this case. I'm going to remove the face, only faces, and we're just going to live with the setup there. Let's select the entire edges, and I'm going to subdivide that so I can actually have enough geometry to add a line down the center. And in the top view, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to extrude out a line with an arrow, like so. So I know exactly what's going on there. And for some reason, it snapped up on the grid a bit higher. So let's fix that. Scale Z0, done. All right, cool. All right. Let's grab the COG control and pick the COG shape. Let's firstly rename that F2 widget COG. All right, cool. And you'll see I have a problem here. The shape is going in the wrong direction. So I talked about this in my previous rigging series, but that's basically due to the orientation of the joints or orientation of the bone versus the orientation of our shape here. So all we need to do is basically, firstly, I'm going to rotate this to sort of suit the orientation of our setup here in object mode, not in local mode, object mode. Just to line it up a little bit, just to make it a little bit easier to, you know, see how things are going to be shaped. I'm then going to go into edit mode and then rotate in the X to make sure it fits appropriately. Oops, turn off snapping. So there's our global control. There's our COG control up and running. Now I'm back in object mode, just setting up the scale just a little bit, just to make sure it's sort of, you know, when I look at it organizationally wise, it fits. Okay, move that to the widget control. We don't need that anymore. We can hide it. And there we go. There's our global control. Our COG control working its magic. Perfect. Okay. Let's get the hip control up and running. Let's grab another circle. Actually, I'm going to duplicate the widget control for this global. I'm going to duplicate that, and I'm going to rename that as widget hips. And I'm just going to give it a little bit of a change in the shape. So I'm going to give it a sort of hip-like shape. So I'm going to select everything there. Scale a little bit, like so. And then using soft select, I'm going to give it a sort of like a pelvis-like shape. There we go. Nice and easy. So there's our hip control. Let's go into pose mode and select that as our custom object. Boom. Got the same problem there. We need to actually rotate these hips, the hip control, to fit. So I'm actually going to go into object pose mode, cursor to selected, Go back into object mode. Section of the cursor, just to line it up. Like so. And then go into edit mode with that object. Rotate X up to the appropriate setup. And I'm just going to scale it up in edit mode to sort of fit that shape. Alright, cool. There's our hips out the way. So now we have a control for the COG. A control for the hips. And now we just need controls for the spine, so the torso. Okay. Let's do that now. We're going to grab, again, I'm just going to grab this guy, but I'm going to remove the arrows. So I'm going to actually grab the widget from the COG, also from the global control. I'm going to duplicate that once more, just to save time. Rename that as, I'm just going to call it widget FK. And go into edit mode. I'm just going to delete the arrow. I don't need that anymore. Delete the vertices and just have that line down the center, so you know where the center line is, but you just know it just helps indicate the rotation. Okay. And for the FK here, I'm gonna choose widget FK. I'm gonna do the same thing for all of these joints here. Widget FK and widget FK. And you can see that the bones scale actually reflects the scale of the control there, but we don't have to worry about that right now. Let's just rotate this control once more. Rotate X, that'll do. Done. So to make these controllers a bit more larger, all we're going to do is go into pose mode and change the scale of the custom object in the custom shape properties. Boom. Okay, there's our setup. Basic setup, all done. So let's reiterate what we've done. Let's cap it off. So what we've got a global control that's controlling everything. We got a COG that's controlling the center of gravity of our character. And if we had FK legs already, this would be, the FK legs would stick to the COG. Would stick to the global control, and the COG would control the rest of the body. So this is our torso control, essentially. Global torso control. We have our hips, which control the lower half of our body. Perfect. Okay. And then we have a very simple FK joint chain. This is as simple as you can get. And we're practically done. And if you want to, you can go into your bone group section now. You can actually add colors. So if you want to, you can add colors to our bone group. So I can actually call this global. Assign a color. Doom. Make a new one. Actually, I'll add that to the red one as well. For the hips, I'll make that one yellow. Call that hips. And then for the spine, I can make it blue. Boom. And if we go to our pose mode, you can see it's all set up. Perfect. Looking pretty pro. Alright. And that's it. When it comes to a very simple, basic FK spine rig, that's how you do it, basically. Oops. There we go. Alright. So maybe you're asking, why didn't I just add the control shapes to the deform joints? Why didn't I just add them to these ones? Well, it's pretty simple. One, organizationally, it's much easier to know which of your bones are deform joints and which ones are control joints. Secondly, when it comes to exporting out a rig, exporting out a weight painted piece of animation into a, say, game engine, you want to be able to quickly select all your deform joints and your mesh and just export it without worrying about the control setup. So you want to have it separate at all times. By separating the controls from the deform setup, that allows you to quickly make sure that when you export a animation rig with just the deformed joints, that you are definitely just exporting out the deformed joints and not the control joints. That's why. It just makes it way easier to organize. You know that these are the only joints that you're going to be using for weight painting. You know that these ones don't have any influence on the weights, so you don't have to worry about weight painting these controls and going through the controls in the hierarchy. You know exactly that on this layer, anything on this layer is deforming, anything else is not deforming. They're just mechanisms and controls. That's why. Okay. Anyway, I hope this wasn't too confusing for you to start off with, but that's basically it. In the next video, we'll talk about a more advanced spine technique using bendy bones. And then after that, we'll try another spine technique using Spline IK. But until then, catch us and have fun.